These references to truth and reconciliation are nothing but. It is about falsehoods being used to push through an authoritarian agenda. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is a major issue in Powell River and the rest of Canada. It's highly improbable that remains are actually there because not one parent has said that their child never came home from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. We need a reckoning on this issue.
Teachers, lawyers, judges, politicians, even journalists. Not a single professional is safe from the ideological wrath aimed at those who dare to question the narrative around residential schools in Canada. Especially when you tell the truth about the nefarious unmarked grave claims that swept across the country 4 years ago. That truth is that despite the headlines and moral panic, not a single body has been unearthed to date, including at the Kamloops residential school site, where the world was told 215 children's remains were found as young as 3 years old, discovered there. It was the catalyst to churches burning and millions of dollars being handed out to nearly 100 banned governments. But who's counting? I'm Drea Humphrey with Rebel News, and in 2022, I did a documentary called Kamloops: The Buried Truth, which you can find at our site called kamloopsdocumentary.com that debunked that claim. But today, I bring you an important interview with a newer documentary, What Remains. It was produced by Simon Hergott, a former global news journalist fired after questioning politically correct narratives, and Dr. Francis Widdowson, an Indigenous studies expert and former Calgary Mount Pleasant professor who was wrongfully dismissed after stating unpopular truths about residential schools. And she's also the contributor to this book, A Grave Error: How the Media Misled Us and the Truth About Residential Schools. Her documentary tracks another concerning example of the fallout of the false unmarked grave discovery claims, in particular, how that false claim continues to divide communities like the Sunshine Coast, Powell River.
Kamloops seems like that might just have had a local impact, but it's had massive implications all over the country. And the case of Powell River is a very important case study in how that case was used to manipulate people within the town.
Let's unpack that a little bit more. Now, I did, of course, cover the Tla'amin Nation wanting to have the name change and other locals as well. But for those who didn't see any of that coverage, they don't know anything, give us the brief background of what happened there after this 215 claim.
Yes, so what happened is that in, I believe it was May 2021, there were some discussions about the possibility of changing the name. But when the Kamloops announcement occurred, the chief of the Tla'amin Nation, John Hackett, sent this very terse demanding letter, which basically said, because of the 215 graves of children at Kamloops, this name would have to be changed, and it was not a question of if, it was a matter of when. And as well mentioned the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which also was another consequence of the Kamloops claim, because there was opposition to that in Parliament from, I think, 5 provinces and the Conservative Party. But when that claim was made, that false claim was made, it got pushed through in June of 2021. So the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is a major issue in Powell River and the rest of Canada, and also the changing of the name. And that has resulted in terrible conflicts emerging in the town that really were not present before. These references to truth and reconciliation are nothing but. It is about falsehoods being used to push through an authoritarian agenda, which is resulting in terrible conflicts between neighbors that never really existed before.
Now, I want to talk to you about UNDRIP a little later in this interview because I think it's important. I've covered it for years, but people seem to be just waking up to it, and it kind of deserves a little bit more attention. But I want to circle back to the Powell River name change because I learned something in your documentary. There's a lot of stuff that a lot of people will find valuable, but I didn't realize that the name of Powell River might not even be named after Israel Powell, who was in charge of coming up with the day school, residential schools. So that's crazy. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so there's two researchers in Powell River, Robin Tremblay and Arthur Richards, who have both done extensive research on this subject. And there's quite a lot of material on the internet if people are interested in that issue. But what was found is that, first of all, Israel Powell was not really involved with the residential schools. He was involved with the day schools. I think there was actually one school that got formed when he was the head of the Department of Indian Affairs. And the Kamloops Indian Residential School was actually requested by the chief of the band at that time, whose name was Little Louie, who was very interested in education and wanted the members of his band to be able to obtain a high quality education, which the residential schools were known for, having better standards than the local day schools. And as well, especially Robin Tremblay has delved deeply into why Powell River was called Powell. And it turns out that there was a cartographer whose name was Edward Powell. And you can see the name Edward Powell on the maps, like his name was put on the maps. And there's really no evidence that the town was named after Israel Powell at all. Powell never acknowledged any naming of the town. And as well, it was often the case that places would be named after the person who actually mapped the region. So it's far more likely that it was Edward Powell and not Israel Powell that the name of Powell River has came to be.
It is so shocking, this pattern we're seeing of blowing up history based on a lack of evidence, and sometimes when the evidence is so clear. The media has played a huge role in that. You mentioned who you partnered with on this documentary, Simon Hergott, and he speaks a little bit. We're just going to show a brief clip of him talking about his role working with global news as the false 215 claim came out.
Our government-funded media, such as Global News, is also very responsible for this narrative being pushed forward.
Acknowledging that they're coming from a place of trauma and grief, to Kamloops Teshwetmik Chief Roseanne Casimir gave the first update to the media since news broke of the horrifying apparent find last week.
This is Paul Johnson of Global News you are hearing right now. I worked with Paul on these stories when the announcement of the finds were released. My concerns about the inconclusive nature of the alleged graves went unheeded, and it was made clear to me that that wasn't the angle we were to take.
As far as technical details about what equipment was used, who conducted the search with ground-penetrating radar, and how that data was processed and analyzed, those facts will be released to the public, but not now.
And these findings still have not been released. The information has been kept from the public and will likely never be made clear.
Absolutely, I agree. The media played a big role. You point out sort of a breakdown in institutions, in academia as well when it comes to this narrative being pushed. Why do you think so many smart people have turned their back on the truth about this issue?
Well, I think it's due to the capture of our institutions by equity, diversity, and inclusion ideology. It's not just universities, it's all over, bureaucracies, hospitals, school boards, and so on. And one element of this is that in order to increase the numbers of people working in these institutions in what's usually called the professional managerial class, you need to make members of oppressed groups feel that they belong in these institutions. And it's argued that in order to make these members of these groups feel that they belong, you need to affirm what they believe to be true, even if what they believe to be true is false. And this is exactly what has happened with the Kamloops case. And we're seeing it, it doesn't stop. Like,
Yeah.
I've just posted a number of clips of Ted Gottfriedson Jr., who is a very prominent member of the Kamloops Band, Dee DeRose, who is the chancellor of Thompson Rivers University. And in September 2024, the two of them on the Thompson Rivers University website were saying about these children's bodies that were found at Kamloops. This is 3 years later, after we know Sarah Beaulier, who's the GPR expert, stated in July 2021 that remains had not been found and only excavations would be able to determine whether there were remains there. And the band received $12.1 million to do these excavations between 2021 to 2023, and it has not done them. And so we now are at this point where we need a reckoning on this issue. We can't just let it go and say, oh, well, it doesn't matter. You know, the whole country has been turned upside down, and we still have the ramifications of it. And 60% of the Canadian public, according to Eric Kaufman, believe that a mass grave was found in Kamloops. And the reason why they believe that is because the institutions that put out these false claims in 2021 have never stood up and announced that they made a mistake, and we really need to understand that there are no remains that have been found. We need excavations, and to add a little bit more context, it's highly improbable that remains are actually there, because not one parent has said that their child never came home from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So if that's the case, who are the 200, not 215, because Sarah Beaulier said that it was not 215, it was 200, because 15 of the 215 were actually shovel test pits that were dug by the archaeology department that she was unaware of when she originally did her survey. So there's all sorts of issues that still need to be unpacked with respect to this case, and we need to have a nationwide reckoning of how such falsehoods could have been perpetuated for so long with no correction occurring.
Band governments could be getting away with fraud with the tax dollars, but your documentary exposes that it's gone from, there's still many people who still believe that claim, but the ones that don't are just starting to say, well, even if it is for some nefarious reason, I don't think that really matters. It's quite shocking. Now, I want to ask you about UNDRIP. That's the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. In British Columbia, I've done many reports on how we adopted it as law under what is abbreviated as DRIPA, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. We've also adopted it federally, but many people are just now starting to learn why that should matter for Canadians. And I've been trying to unpack it provincially. Could you tell us a little bit, maybe just give an example federally on why this is an issue?
Yes, and I actually have been studying UNDRIP for over 10 years, but I was looking at the actual symbolic kind of gesture that was made by the United Nations. I hadn't really looked at it in the sense of it being put into a piece of legislation. And that is the major problem that has happened, is that because it is now binding, it is going to have far more significant implications than when it was just a kind of a motherhood statement about how Aboriginal cultures should be respected and so on. The biggest problem with UNDRIP is that it brings an ethnic principle into what is really a geographical political system. So we have provinces which have a certain jurisdiction. We have the national government, the federal government, which has a nationwide geographical jurisdiction. But what happens with UNDRIP is that it has wording which is about Indigenous people on the lands. They're having some kind of control over what happens on their lands. And it's because of all the disputes that are occurring in British Columbia, it's not very clear what exactly Indigenous lands are. And this means that you need to obtain the consent of an ethnic group over which Canadians, non-Indigenous Canadians, have no control over. They don't vote in those governments. They can't hold those governments accountable. And so it means that things don't operate according to liberal democratic principles anymore. Mm-hmm. They operate according to ethnic principles. And you see this in a number of issues. The big one is Pender Harbor in the case of British Columbia, where there's some people who have docks, and in order to get their docks approved or to be changed, they have to have this approved by a joint committee, which is made up of Aboriginal governments and the provincial government. Mm-hmm. And so the residents of Pender Harbor have no way of controlling anything that happens in those Aboriginal governments. And so it creates an unaccountable form of governance that is based upon an ethnic principle, which goes against the liberal democratic geographical principle that we have in Canada, in both the provincial and national governments.
And it goes against democracy in the sense that, 95% of the Canadians can't even elect, the officials in these banned governments, yet they would have so much power over Crown land and beyond, it seems. Well, thank you so much for continuing to be faithful in exposing this very important matter. I encourage people to take a look. We've linked the documentary, What Remains, in the description. You can find the article for this with the linked documentary, and follow Francis Widdowson as well that way. So thank you for being back on Rebel News.
Thanks for having me on.
At Rebel News, we believe that the public deserves transparency and truth, and that includes with banned governments. If you appreciate the important work that we do, you can find more reports just like this and donate what you can to support more in the future at our special website called kamloopsdocumentary.com.